Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the massive battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed across the vast Pacific Ocean. The morning of June 3, 1942, brought with it the promise of what would become Japan's greatest naval triumph, or so he believed. The combined fleet, the most powerful naval armada ever assembled by the Empire of Japan, steamed toward a tiny coral atoll called Midway, carrying with it the hopes of a nation and the weight of destiny. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen before the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans, Yamamoto knew, were reeling, their Pacific fleet crippled, and their morale shattered. Now came the moment to deliver the killing blow that would force the United States to sue for peace. The plan was audacious in its complexity and breathtaking in its scope. Operation MI, as it was codenamed, would lure the remaining elements of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japanese superior numbers and battle-tested pilots would crush American resistance once and for all. Midway Atoll, that insignificant speck of coral and sand lying 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, would serve as the bait in an elaborate trap. Yamamoto's fleet was divided into multiple task forces, each with a specific role in the grand design. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the mobile force, centered around 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These floating airfields carried the cream of Japanese naval aviation, over 200 aircraft piloted by veterans, who had honed their skills in the skies over China and perfected their techniques at Pearl Harbor. Supporting them was Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force, while Yamamoto himself led the main body from far to the rear, ready to engage any American surface ships that survived the initial onslaught. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, fielding 8 carriers, 11 battleships, 22 cruisers, and 65 destroyers against whatever pitiful force the Americans might muster. The morning sun painted the ocean in brilliant shades of gold and crimson as Nagumo's carriers prepared to launch their first strike against Midway. Below decks, pilots performed final checks on their aircraft, while ground crews armed the planes with bombs and torpedoes. The Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers represented the finest naval aviation technology in the world, while the legendary Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters had established aerial supremacy wherever they had flown. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave at Pearl Harbor, would have commanded this strike as well. But appendicitis had grounded the ace pilot. In his place, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga would lead 108 aircraft toward Midway at 0430 hours. As the planes launched in the pre-dawn darkness, their engines roaring to life and propellers spinning into invisible blurs, few aboard the Japanese carriers could have imagined that they were flying toward a carefully prepared trap. Unknown to the Japanese, their secret codes had been broken. Deep in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts had been working around the clock to decode Japanese naval communications. The Americans knew Operation MI was coming, they knew when, and they knew where. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the soft-spoken but steel-willed commander of the Pacific Fleet, had positioned his forces accordingly, turning the hunters into the hunted. 300 miles northeast of Midway, Admiral Raymond Spruance peered through his binoculars at the dawn horizon, his calm demeanor masking the tension that gripped every man aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise. Beside her steamed the carrier Yorktown, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the carrier Hornet, her flight deck crowded with the twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers that had carried out the daring Doolittle raid on Japan itself. just 2 months earlier. The American force was pitifully small compared to the Japanese armada bearing down on them, only 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. But what they lacked in numbers, they possessed in something far more valuable: complete knowledge of enemy intentions. The breaking of the Japanese naval code JN-25 had given Admiral Nimitz an unprecedented window into enemy planning, allowing him to position his forces for maximum advantage despite their numerical inferiority. Spruance, a quiet and methodical officer who had taken command of Task Force 16 after Admiral William Bull Halsey fell ill with a skin condition, understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. This would not be another hit-and-run raid or a skirmish over some distant island. This would be the decisive naval battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Victory would give the Americans a chance to seize the initiative. Defeat would leave the west coast of the United States defenseless against Japanese invasion. At 05:34 hours on June 4th, a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted the Japanese strike force approaching Midway. Enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 180 miles. The electrifying message crackled across the radio frequencies, instantly transforming the morning calm into organized chaos as American forces prepared to meet the assault. On Midway itself, Marine fighters scrambled to intercept the incoming Japanese bombers. The obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and handful of Grumman F-4F Wildcats were hopelessly outmatched by the nimble Zeros, but they climbed into the morning sky anyway, their young pilots grimly determined to sell their lives dearly. Major Floyd Parks led the Marine fighters into what he knew would be a one-way mission, radioing back to base. "Hawks at Angels 12, coming in from the northwest." Within minutes, the sky above Midway erupted into a deadly aerial ballet as Japanese bombers dove toward their targets while American and Japanese fighters twisted and turned in mortal combat. The attack on Midway was devastating but not decisive. Tomonaga's bombers cratered runways and destroyed buildings, but they failed to knock out the atoll's defensive capabilities entirely. More importantly, they encountered fierce resistance that suggested Midway's defenders were alert and ready for battle. As Tomonaga's planes limped back toward the Japanese carriers, the strike leader radioed a message that would prove fatal to Japanese hopes. There is need for a second attack wave. This single transmission set in motion a chain of events that would transform Japanese victory into catastrophic defeat. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision. His remaining aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against American ships, but Tomonaga's request suggested they should be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for another strike against Midway's installations. The process of changing armaments would take precious time that would leave his carriers vulnerable to attack. As Japanese ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons on the waiting aircraft, radar operators on the American carriers tracked the returning Japanese strike force. The moment had come to launch their own attack, catching the enemy carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with their flight decks crowded with rearming aircraft and their combat air patrol depleted by the fighting over Midway. "Shut, Lieutenant." Commander John Waldron adjusted his goggles and checked his instruments one final time, as his squadron of 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers prepared to launch from the Hornet. The morning of June 4th had begun with the promise of glory, but as Waldron looked at the obsolete aircraft around him and thought about the enemy they would face, a grim determination settled over him. The Devastator was a death trap, slow, poorly armored, and vulnerable to fighter attack, but it was all they had. "Attack immediately," came the order from Admiral Spruance at 07:02 hours. The die was cast, and across the 3 American carriers, flight crews scrambled to launch every available aircraft. The Enterprise launched 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 14 Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 Wildcat fighters. The Yorktown contributed 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers, and 6 fighters. The Hornet added 35 dive bombers and 15 torpedo bombers to the strike force, though coordination problems would plague their attack. Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 took off first, followed by the dive bombers and fighters. But in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, finding the enemy proved more challenging than expected. Navigation errors and radio failures scattered the American strike forces, with different squadrons heading toward different compass bearings, in search of the Japanese carriers. What should have been a coordinated assault instead became a series of piecemeal attacks that would test American courage to its absolute limits. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carriers, Admiral Nagumo was wrestling with a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The rearming of his aircraft was proceeding slowly, with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs being removed and replaced with high-explosive bombs for the second Midway strike. Then, at 0728 hours, everything changed. A Japanese reconnaissance plane finally reported what Nagumo had been dreading. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010, distance 240 miles from Midway. The American fleet had been found, but Nagumo's aircraft were caught, in the worst possible position, half-armed with the wrong weapons and scattered across 4 different carriers. The admiral ordered his planes to be rearmed once again, this time with anti-ship weapons, but the process would take another hour. His carriers were naked, protected only by their combat air patrol of 0 fighters and whatever anti-aircraft guns they could bring to bear. At 0920 hours, Waldron's torpedo bombers found the Japanese carriers, flying barely 50 feet above the wave tops at a painfully slow 110 knots. The 15 Devastators approached the Kaga in a textbook torpedo attack. But the Japanese were ready. 0 fighters dove from above while the carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened up with a murderous barrage of fire. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down, their crews dying in flaming crashes or disappearing beneath the Pacific waves. Waldron himself was among the first to fall, his aircraft crashing into the sea after being riddled with bullets from a diving Zero. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 Devastators had been destroyed, their torpedoes missing their targets or failing to explode. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water and watching in horror as his squadron mates perished around him. The sacrifice seemed meaningless, a tragic waste of brave men and obsolete aircraft. But Torpedo Squadron 8's suicidal charge had achieved something crucial without anyone realizing it at the time. The Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level to massacre the torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude approaches to the carriers completely undefended. As Gay floated in his life raft amid the wreckage of his squadron, he looked up to see formations of American dive bombers approaching from 20,000 feet, unopposed and undetected. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey squinted through the glare of the morning sun as he led 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in a desperate search for the Japanese carriers. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and several of his pilots had already radioed that they were approaching the point of no return, the moment when they would lack sufficient fuel to return to their carrier even if they turned around, immediately. For over an hour, McCluskey's squadron had searched the empty ocean, following outdated intelligence that had placed the Japanese fleet in the wrong position. The young naval aviator faced an agonizing decision: continue the search and risk losing his entire squadron to fuel exhaustion, or turn back with their mission unfulfilled and leave the Japanese carriers free to launch their own devastating counterstrike against the American fleet. Then, at 0955 hours, McCluskey spotted something that changed everything: a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward across the Pacific, leaving a distinctive white wake in the blue water. The USS Nautilus, an American submarine, had attempted to attack the Japanese carriers earlier and had been driven off by this destroyer, the Arashi. Now, unknowingly, the Japanese warship was leading the American dive bombers directly to their target. Following the destroyer's wake, McCluskey soon saw the most beautiful sight of his military career: 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming. In formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were clearly visible, while the Hiryu was partially hidden by a rain squall. At exactly 10:24 hours, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a steep dive and spoke the words that would echo through naval history. "Attack! Attack! Attack!" What followed was the most decisive 5 minutes in the history of naval warfare. McCluskey's dive bombers plunged toward their targets at terminal velocity, their airframes screaming as they knifed through the thin air. The Japanese carriers, caught with their aircraft being serviced on deck and their combat air patrol out of position after destroying the American torpedo bombers, were sitting ducks. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was the first to die. Lieutenant Dick Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded among the aircraft being rearmed below, triggering a chain reaction of secondary explosions as aviation fuel and ammunition cooked off. Within minutes, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was a blazing inferno, her flight deck buckled and twisted beyond repair. Simultaneously, the Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate. Multiple bomb hits turned the massive carrier into a floating volcano as her magazine exploded in a towering pillar of flame and smoke. The ship that had participated in every major Japanese naval operation since the attack on Pearl Harbor was doomed, her crew abandoning ship as fires raged beyond control throughout her length. The Soryu met a similar end as lieutenant commander. Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown joined the attack. 3 direct hits in as many minutes transformed the carrier into a blazing wreck, her wooden flight deck feeding the flames that consumed her from stem to stern. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto chose to go down with his ship, lashing himself to the bridge as his crew evacuated the dying carrier. As referenced in Gordon Pranga's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, these 5 minutes of perfectly executed dive-bombing attacks destroyed 3/4 of Japan's premier carrier striking force and eliminated over 250 veteran aircraft along with their irreplaceable pilots. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, painstakingly built up over years of training and combat experience, vanished in a holocaust of high explosive and aviation fuel. From his position floating in the water, Ensign George Gay watched in amazement as the Japanese carriers erupted in flames around him. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had not been in vain after all. Their suicidal attack had pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level at the exact moment when the American dive bombers needed clear skies for their approach. In 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War had been reversed. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, the sole survivor of what had been the most powerful naval striking force in history just hours earlier. Around him, the Pacific Ocean was littered with the burning hulks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their twisted flight decks and smoking superstructures serving as monuments to Japanese hubris and American determination. The Hiryu had escaped the devastating American dive bomber attack only because a rain squall had hidden her from the enemy pilot's view. Now, as the only operational Japanese carrier remaining in the battle, she carried the full weight of the Empire's hopes for victory. Yamaguchi, known throughout the fleet as an aggressive and innovative commander, was determined to strike back at the Americans with everything he had left. At 10:54 hours, 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from the Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, which had been spotted by Japanese reconnaissance, aircraft approximately 100 miles to the northeast. For the pilots climbing into the morning sky, this mission represented more than just another attack. It was their chance to avenge their fallen comrades and restore honor to the Imperial. Japanese Navy, the Yorktown, under the command of Captain Elliot Buckmaster, had been expecting this counterstrike. Her radar operators had detected the incoming Japanese aircraft while they were still 50 miles away, giving the carrier precious minutes to prepare her defenses. Fighter direction officers vectored 12 Wildcat fighters to intercept the attackers, while the ship's anti-aircraft gunners manned their stations and prepared for the coming assault. The air battle that erupted over the Yorktown was savage and brief. The American Wildcats, though inferior to the nimble Zeros in aerial combat, fought with desperate courage to protect their carrier. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading the American fighters, employed innovative tactics that would later be known as the Thatch Weave, using mutual support between pairs of fighters to negate the Zeros' advantages in speed and maneuverability. Despite the fierce resistance, several Japanese dive bombers broke through the defensive screen. At 12:10 hours, 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in quick succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay, starting fires among the stored aircraft. The second hit near the island superstructure, knocking out radar and communications equipment. The third bomb struck the stack area, extinguishing the boilers and bringing the great ship to a dead stop in the water. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Japanese had achieved their revenge. The Yorktown listed heavily to port as damage. Control parties fought the fires raging throughout her interior. But American naval engineering and damage control techniques proved superior to Japanese expectations. Within an hour, the carrier's crew had the fires under control and the ship underway again, her flight deck operational enough to recover aircraft. The site of the Yorktown apparently recovered from the first attack spurred Admiral Yamaguchi to launch a second strike. At 10:30 hours, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters roared off the Hiryu's deck, determined to finish what the dive bombers had started. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway and whose own plane had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire, insisted on leading this mission despite his aircraft's condition. The second attack proved even more devastating than the first. Approaching from multiple directions, the Japanese torpedo bombers split their attack to divide the American defensive fire. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown on her port side, the underwater explosions buckling her hull plates and flooding multiple compartments. The carrier began listing so severely that Captain Buckmaster was forced to order abandon ship at 20:55 hours, fearing she might capsize and trap hundreds of sailors below decks. As the crew of the Yorktown lowered lifeboats and prepared to evacuate their dying ship, Admiral Yamaguchi prepared the Hiryu for one final desperate gambit. With only a handful of aircraft remaining, he would attempt to locate and attack the other American carriers, hoping to inflict enough damage to force their withdrawal from the battle. But unknown to the Japanese admiral, his own ship had already been spotted by American search planes, and a massive retaliatory strike was already being prepared. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher pushed his SBD Dauntless into a screaming dive toward the Japanese carrier Hiryu, the last surviving flat top of the once mighty Kido Butai. Below him, the enemy ship twisted desperately through the Pacific swells, her captain throwing the helm hard over in a futile attempt to avoid the American dive bombers plunging toward her flight deck like mechanical hawks stooping on their prey. It was 5:05 in the evening of June 4th, 1942, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that seemed to mirror the fires consuming the Japanese fleet. 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise had found their target after a long search, guided by reports from search planes that had spotted the Hiryu attempting to escape northward after launching her final desperate attacks against the Yorktown. Admiral Yamaguchi had tried everything to save his ship and salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the Japanese fleet. After launching 2 successful strikes against the Yorktown, he had ordered the Hiryu to withdraw at maximum speed while preparing his remaining aircraft for one last attack against the American carriers. But the Hiryu had been operating alone for hours without the protective screen of destroyers and cruisers that might have provided early warning of approaching enemy aircraft. The American dive bombers achieved complete surprise, their approach masked by the setting sun and the Japanese. preoccupation with preparing their own strike. As Gallagher's bomb plunged toward the Hiryu's flight deck, the last major unit of the Kido Butai was caught in the same vulnerable condition that had doomed her sister ships that morning. Aircraft spotted on deck, fuel lines connected, and ordnance being loaded for the next mission. 4 direct hits in rapid succession transformed the Hiryu from a fighting ship into a blazing wreck. The first bomb penetrated the forward flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay, igniting stored aircraft and aviation fuel. The second and third hits struck amidships, starting additional fires and damaging the ship's vital firefighting systems. The fourth bomb hit aft, destroying the after elevator and sealing the fate of Japan's last operational carrier in the Pacific. As flames engulfed his flagship, Admiral Yamaguchi faced the same agonizing decision that had confronted his fellow admirals throughout the day. The Hiryu was clearly doomed, her wooden flight deck and superstructure feeding fires that raged beyond any hope of control. By 8:30 that evening, Captain Tomeo Kaku reported to Yamaguchi that the ship could not be saved and recommended that the crew abandon ship to save as many lives as possible. But Yamaguchi, in keeping with the traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the code of Bushido that governed samurai conduct, refused to survive the destruction of his command. At 10:25 that night, as the last of his surviving crewmen were evacuated to waiting destroyers, the Admiral and Captain Kaku remained aboard the burning carrier, choosing death before dishonor. Their final radio message, transmitted as fires consumed the ship's bridge, epitomized the tragic nobility that characterized the Japanese military tradition. "We have fought bravely. Long live His Imperial Majesty the Emperor." The loss of the Hiryu completed the destruction of the Kido Butai, the elite carrier-striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months and had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier. 4 fleet carriers representing the heart of Japanese naval aviation lay on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, along with over 300 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The rising sun that had blazed so brilliantly across the Pacific since Pearl Harbor had been extinguished in a single day of battle. Meanwhile, American damage control parties were performing their own miracle aboard the seemingly doomed Yorktown. Despite taking multiple bomb and torpedo hits, the carrier's crew refused to give up their ship. Throughout the night of June 4th and into the following day, sailors worked frantically to correct the ship's list, patch hull breaches, and restore power to vital systems. Their efforts would ultimately prove unsuccessful. The Yorktown would be sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later. But their determination exemplified the fighting spirit that was carrying America toward ultimate victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in stunned silence aboard the battleship Yamato, reading and rereading the catastrophic reports flooding in from the stricken carriers of the mobile force. In the space of a few hours, his carefully planned operation had transformed from certain victory into unmitigated disaster. The 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone, taking with them the cream of Japanese naval aviation and any hope of achieving decisive victory in the Pacific War. The architect of Pearl Harbor found himself facing a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. His main body still possessed overwhelming surface strength, including the mighty Yamato with her 18-inch guns, supported by multiple battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The temptation to continue westward and engage the American fleet in a night surface action was almost overwhelming, offering the possibility of salvaging something from the wreckage of Operation MI. But Yamamoto was too experienced a naval commander to let emotion override strategic judgment. His carriers were gone, meaning he had no air cover for his remaining ships. The Americans, despite their losses, still possessed 2 operational carriers and could launch air attacks throughout the following day against his exposed surface fleet. Most critically, the element of surprise had been completely lost. The Americans clearly knew his strength, position, and intentions. At 00:15 hours on June 5, 1942, Yamamoto issued the order that formally acknowledged Japan's first major defeat of the Pacific War. Operation MI is cancelled. The combined fleet will withdraw to the northwest. The greatest naval armada ever assembled by the Empire of Japan began its long retreat toward home waters, carrying with it the shattered dreams of Japanese expansion and the growing realization that the tide of war had turned. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would reverberate throughout the remainder of World War II and beyond. In 4 days of fighting, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, over 250 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 trained naval personnel. More importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the growing confidence of American forces who now knew they could defeat their seemingly superior enemies. The strategic implications of the American victory were immediately apparent to military analysts on both sides of the Pacific. Japan's carrier strength had been cut in half, while their trained pilot reserves, painstakingly built up over years of preparation, had been decimated. The Empire's ability to conduct offensive operations was severely compromised, forcing them into an increasingly defensive posture as American industrial might began to tip the balance of power. For the United States, Midway represented the turning point that transformed them from victims of aggression into masters of their own destiny in the Pacific theater. Admiral Nimitz's bold decision to commit his entire available carrier strength to the battle, based on intelligence estimates of enemy intentions, had paid off spectacularly. The victory provided breathing space for American industry to produce the ships, aircraft, and weapons that would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. The human cost of victory had been significant, but manageable for the Americans. The carrier Yorktown and destroyer Hammond had been lost to submarine attack, while aircraft losses totaled approximately 150 planes. But American industrial capacity could replace these losses within months, while Japan's shattered carrier force would take years to rebuild. Time they would not be granted as American offensives began rolling across the Pacific. As the sun set, on June 6, 1942, painting the Pacific in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, the last Japanese ships disappeared over the northwestern horizon, their wakes the only evidence of the greatest naval battle in history. Behind them, American ships began the grim task of rescuing survivors and recovering the dead from the oil-slicked waters around Midway Atoll. The faith that Japan had placed in naval dominance lay shattered on the ocean floor along with the sunken carriers and their precious aircraft. The surprise counterstrike that began with the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and climaxed with the devastating dive bomber attacks had obliterated 6 months of Japanese victories in 5 minutes of perfect execution. The rising sun had reached its zenith at Midway and would never shine so brightly again, as America began its inexorable advance toward the Japanese home islands and final victory in the Pacific War. In the words of Admiral Nimitz, summarizing the battle's significance, Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence and courage. The intelligence breakthrough that allowed American forces to position themselves perfectly for the coming battle, combined with the extraordinary courage of pilots who flew obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds, had achieved one of the most decisive victories in naval history and altered the course of World War II forever.